It was a rather grey and gloomy late autumn morning in Melbourne, Australia, in 1892. The cobblestone streets shimmered with the morning dew, and the click of hooves and the sounds of bustling early morning workers began to filter through the alleys and inner city suburbs. The city itself was reeling from the effects of a catastrophic economic crash the year prior. The attitude of brazen optimism which had since come to define the city during the gold rush was fading, and it became evident that the era of rapid and unsustainable growth had come to an end. At the height of its economic power, Melbourne was at one point made the wealthiest city in the world. As housing prices fell and people lost their jobs, a sense of restlessness began to replace the blind optimism which had been ingrained in the social consciousness of those early Melburnians. This made it of no surprise that in the early hours of Tuesday, the 23rd of May, 1892, a crowd was gathering on the silky cobblestone streets out the front of the Old Melbourne Jail. The first eager onlookers began arriving at the jail as early as 6 o'clock in the morning, and within a matter of hours the crowd had soon swelled into the thousands. Some reports put the estimated figure as high as 12,000. For this was not just any morning. A long-anticipated hanging was set to take place. He went by many aliases, be it Baron Swanston, Albert Williams, or Harry Lawson, known to us today as Frederick Bailey Deeming. The life of the man, just shy of 40 years old, who was responsible for what the international media at the time had dubbed the crime of the century, was soon to come to an end. But the story of the death and destruction he unleashed across 4 separate continents would only get more perplexing as time ticked forward. The reason for the near unprecedented public interest in the demise of Deeming was of little surprise, as from the moment his crimes in Australia were made public, Jack the Ripper comparisons were sprawled across the front page of every newspaper in the pre-federated colonies of Australia. Labeled the Jack the Ripper of the Southern Seas. Prejudicial publicity his lawyers, which included future Prime Minister Alfred Deakin, strenuously denied, seeing their clients' chances of receiving a fair trial fade with each sensational headline. It is important to note that with regards to the Jack the Ripper case in general, one guess is as good as another, and this story is not intended to derive a definitive answer. Still, for many, seemingly Scotland Yard included, Deeming presents a very compelling culprit. The reason for the comparisons, and even self-induced confessions, will become clear. But first, it is important to begin the story in Deeming's country of birth, Victorian-era England. Born in Birkenhead, Cheshire, on the 30th of July, 1853. Deeming seems to have always lived his life on the fringes of sanity. The youngest of 7 children, he was known in youth as Mad Fred, due to his abnormal behavior. Stemming perhaps from the savage beatings meted out by his tinsmith father, who died insane in a workhouse, having attempted suicide on 4 occasions by slashing his own throat. By all accounts, Deeming had a stifling relationship with his Sunday school teacher mother, who instilled her prudish interpretation of the scriptures in him. Her death in 1875 came as a crushing blow, and he suffered a mental breakdown, and later claimed her spirit compelled him to kill. This chaotic upbringing made it of little surprise that after running away to sea at the age of 16, Deeming began life as a career criminal. Deeming carried a Bible with him on all his travels, and was obsessed with concepts of sin and punishment. In what would come to be a series of proven crimes consisting of theft, fraud, and murder stretching from Liverpool to Cape Town, and from Montevideo to Melbourne, Deeming himself admits that there may have been a great deal more that he was guilty of. The 1870s was a turbulent, crime-filled period for the fledgling Deeming, which saw him spend considerable amounts of time in and out of various prisons throughout England. In 1873, at the age of 20, he was convicted of stealing a watch and sentenced to 3 months in prison. By the late 1870s, Deeming's crimes of theft, fraud, and embezzlement were beginning to catch up with him, and he eyed the opportunity for a fresh start aboard the vessel Various, bound for Sydney, Australia. Before fleeing for a new life, however, Deeming and his brother Albert both married their childhood sweethearts, sisters Marie and Martha James, on the same day, on the 28th of February, 1880. Deeming first landed in Sydney in August of 1881, having left his wife behind in England with the cheering assurance that he would soon make a comfortable life in the new country to which she would soon join him. Within no time, he soon found work as a gas fitter and proved himself a capable workman, rapidly obtaining the confidence of his employers. It came therefore as a terrible shock to his friends and acquaintances when, on the eve of his wife's arrival in Sydney in 1882, Deeming was suspected of stealing some brass fittings of trivial value from his employers. As the situation unfolded, it led to the first insight into the true nature of how cold and calculated Deeming could truly be. Despite the suspicions against Deeming, a younger employee 10 years his junior was the one arrested for the theft instead. Friends of the unfortunate boy were fully convinced that the lad had been the victim of a vile conspiracy, and thanks to their intervention, the case was reopened before it could be set down for hearing at the criminal court. Portions of the stolen fittings were found in Deeming's possession, and the lad was liberated without a stain upon his character. Deeming was swiftly sentenced to 6 weeks' imprisonment for the theft, a ruling that had the convicted thief fall fainting to the dock floor, maybe in genuine astonishment, or maybe as an impressive display of theatrical posturing. The next few years went by scarcely without controversy for Deeming, moving his young family all over the colonies of Australia due to unpaid loans. Eventually, the law caught up with him, and he was arrested in Sydney in December of 1887 on charges of fraudulent insolvency. Whilst on bail, Deeming fled to Adelaide, and from there he boarded a vessel with his wife and now 2 children, bound for Cape Town. This time, however, instead of traveling with the hopes of a new life, he saw South Africa as an opportunity to expand on his criminal behavior without his past crimes standing in the way. Changing ships and adopting an alias to throw off pursuers, he arrived in Cape Town with his family in January 1888, sending them ahead to England. The next part in the story of Frederick Bradley Deeming is arguably the most conflicting and enigmatic, as there is an impenetrable 18-month haze in his known movements between March 1888 and October 1889. Due to his up to 35 different known aliases and possibly many more, this was a period in time where Deeming, full of confidence, fell impulsively into crime. His questionable whereabouts during this time were later filled with dubious police and press speculation, especially in South Africa, where Deeming became a patsy for every unsolved swindle and murder that occurred in this period. Coinciding with this era of dubiety surrounding Deeming's known whereabouts, a series of murders were waging through the Whitechapel district in London, the brutality of which had never been seen. The streets of Whitechapel were a living nightmare in 1888. The dimly lit alleyways were filled with the sounds of poverty and desperation, with people huddling together in fear of the unknown horror that roamed the streets at night. The killer that would become known as Jack the Ripper had begun his gruesome campaign of terror, targeting women in the most savage and brutal ways possible. There were as many as 11 separate unsolved murders within the Whitechapel district, spanning from 1888 to 1891. Of these, however, the canonical 5 are more closely attributed to the unknown serial killer Jack the Ripper than any other. The first victim of the Ripper was Mary Ann Nichols. She was a prostitute, like many of the Ripper's victims, and was found dead on August the 31st, 1888, in Bucks Row. Her throat had been cut, and her abdomen was slashed open, with her intestines exposed. The killer had left her in a gruesome tableau of gore, a warning to those who would dare cross his path. The second victim, Annie Chapman, was killed 1 week later on September the 8th, 1888. She was found in the backyard of a house in Hanbury Street, her body mutilated beyond recognition. Her throat had been cut, and her abdomen was slashed open, with organs removed. The Ripper had taken his savagery to a new level, and the people of Whitechapel were living in a state of constant fear. The third victim, Elizabeth Stride, was killed on the same night as the fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes, on September the 30th, 1888. Stride's body was found in Dutfield's yard, her throat cut from ear to ear. However, the killer was interrupted before he could mutilate her body further, as a witness had seen the two together and alerted the police. The Ripper was forced to flee the scene, leaving his victim's body lying in a pool of blood. Eddowes' body was found only a few hours later in Mitre Square. Her throat was cut, and her abdomen was sliced open. The Ripper had returned to his savagery, taking his anger out on his hapless victim. The police were at a loss, unable to find any clues or leads in their hunt for the Ripper. The fifth and final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was killed 9 days later on November the 9th, 1888, in her room in Miller's Court. Her body was the most brutally mutilated of all the Ripper's victims, with her face hacked beyond recognition and her abdomen completely eviscerated. The Ripper had reached the pinnacle of his savagery, leaving a scene of unspeakable horror that shocked even the most hardened detectives. The 5 canonical murders of Jack the Ripper have become the stuff of legend, a tale of horror and depravity that still haunts the streets of Whitechapel to this day. The Ripper's spree of 5 murders in less than 3 months shocked London to the core and forever carved himself in infamy. The precarious nature in which Deeming places himself in all of this has made it rather easy for his name to forever be associated with that of Jack the Ripper. The job of unraveling the contradictions and incorrect dates of Deeming's timeline throughout this period, which due to his many differing aliases, has been made the most elusive of tasks. Having known to have traveled from South Africa back to England at the beginning of 1888, just prior to the beginning of the canonical 5 Whitechapel murders, Deeming next resurfaces in his usual conniving fashion. While still married to his wife Marie James, whom at this time he had 4 children with, and soon growing tired of the brief period he spent in domesticity throughout the latter stages of 1889, he constructed an elaborate fake marriage to a young, unsuspecting Helen Matherson. After wooing the unwitted innkeeper's daughter through bold claims of wealth and success in Australia, he married her bigamously on the 18th of February 1890, and soon after disappeared, taking expensive wedding gifts with him, defrauding a jeweler from Hull in the process. With investigators hot on his trail, he was caught in Montevideo, Uruguay, and extradited back to England, where he served 9 months in prison for the charge of obtaining goods by false pretenses. This section of Deeming's escapades ties in with the Whitechapel murders, as for a long time he was dismissed as a possible Ripper suspect due to this 9-month prison sentence. However, due to being charged under one of his many aliases, historians have long thought Deemings was incarcerated at the time of the murders, but he was simply unaccounted for. Another reason that is often cited as proof that Deeming could not have been the Ripper is that the South African police accused him of committing elaborate mining and bank fraud during 1888. These crimes spanned the period of the Ripper's spree and took great planning, knowledge of high finance, and the ability to forge complicated geologist reports, certificates, and associated paperwork sufficient to fool not only investors, but bankers who knew their business. Undoubtedly beyond the abilities of Deeming, a badly educated Lancashire plumber. If he had perpetrated these frauds, which many historians rely upon as proof of his being abroad during the Whitechapel murders, he would have been in possession of £5,600, an immense sum in 1888. Furthermore, he would have had no need to risk himself by defrauding Helen Matherson and a jeweler in Hull in 1890. Newly released from prison, and before once again fleeing to Australia as a way of evading his criminal past, Deeming committed his first set of irrefutable murders. On or about the 11th of August 1891, Deeming murdered his long-suffering wife of 11 years, Marie James, and their 4 young children, through the grisly act of slicing their throats. A method remarkably similar to the Whitechapel murders 3 years prior. Deeming then buried their bodies in cement under the house he was renting, an act which would not come to light until after the murder of his second wife, Emily Mather, 9 months later, whom he was courting at the time. During the night on which the crime was perpetrated, the neighbors believed they heard screams. Prompted by curiosity, they visited the house the next day, only to find Deeming, alone and in the best possible spirits, at work cementing the kitchen floor. After marrying his new bride, Emily Mather, they soon found voyage aboard the German steamliner, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, a journey which proved to be not without Deeming's typical controversy and criminal shenanigans. Under the guise of yet another alias, arrived in Melbourne on a balmy December the 16th, 1891. The city was a very different place than the one he left some years earlier. The streets were still busy, but the blind optimism that the gold rush era had brought the residents of Melbourne was fading. In amongst this period of transition for the city, Deeming was in search of a residence. There was nothing remarkable about the villa which stands in Andrew Street, Windsor, a populous Melbourne suburb, when a gentleman calling himself Mr. Droon took possession of it towards the close of the year 1891. It was only one of the many ordinary suburban villas which cluster around the great city, and the new tenant, when he signed his agreement, expressed himself as thoroughly satisfied with all the conveniences which his new home offered. Having paid a few months' rent in advance, the neighbors soon began to notice the appearance, or lack thereof, of any noticeable signs that one would come to expect of a couple inhabiting a small suburban dwelling. The house then sat empty and unattended until March 3rd, 1892. On that day, a lady, attracted by the surroundings of the villa, decided to inspect it with a view to occupancy. She called upon the owner, and with him went over to the house. It was a brick villa, 1 story in height, containing 7 rooms. A small garden relieved the front, and a paling fence divided it from the surrounding dwellings. The front rooms, which were first visited, were found to be entirely satisfactory, but a sickly odor permeated the whole establishment. Perhaps underestimating the sweltering Australian summer, that proved to undermine Deeming's burial method, which had worked to evasive success in his native England, Mrs. Mather's body was found in cement beneath the floorboards of the Windsor rental, in the same grisly manner as Marie James and the Whitechapel victims. Through impressive police work of more than 130 years ago, detectives William Considine and Henry Causey immediately set about checking on the cottage's previous tenant. Using a snippet of a torn boat ticket tracing back to the Kaiser Wilhelm II steamliner, a nationwide search for the alias Albert Williams was launched. This soon turned into a search for the alias Baron Swanston, which resulted in Deeming's arrest in Perth, Australia. By now, the story of Frederick Bailey Deeming, the international serial killer and fraudster, was front-page news worldwide, and Jack the Ripper allegations were soon to follow. The allegations were hardly excessive, as Deeming himself had apparently confessed to prison officials of at least 2 of the Whitechapel murders, perhaps clearing his conscience, or just another chance to garner attention for the career criminal who reveled in notoriety. The fire was stoked further when a man came forward and stated to newspapers that he had proof that Deeming was an acquaintance of Catherine Eddowes, one of the Ripper victims. For the most part, there is nothing more than circumstantial evidence linking Deeming to the Whitechapel murders, which is further shrouded by the 130 years which have since passed. Deeming was clearly a deranged man who was proven to be capable of killing and mutilating 6 people, 4 of them his own children. His known whereabouts fade just before the first Whitechapel murder, and then he reappears just following the 5th and final. Whilst it's far from conclusive, that among other circumstantial evidence points towards Deeming as the Ripper, a lot more than many other known suspects. He walked unsteadily between the guards and several times tottered as if about to fall. His face was ashen and he shook like a man with palsy. Several times when the chaplain spoke to him encouragingly in an undertone, Deeming parted his lips to reply, but he uttered no sound. He seemed to be stupefied by his approaching death. When his arms were pinioned, he wavered, and would have fallen had he not been caught by the warden. At first, he shook his head when his last opportunity to speak was given him. Then he rallied from his stupor, and with a strong effort called out, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." He tried to say more and stood with his mouth half open, but no words came. As the noose was adjusted, his knees knocked together, and he would have collapsed had he not been supported. He died without a struggle, and almost instantly. His body swung limply in front of a large, breathless crowd of ticket-holding officials and members of the press. After his body was taken down, a death mask was made and sent to Scotland Yard, for reference in the murder of Marie James, and in case Deeming claims of being the Ripper were later proven. If you travel to Scotland Yard today, and visit the so-called Black Museum of English Crime Memorabilia, tucked away amongst the death masks and the murder weapons of some of Britain's most heinous criminals, there lies the plaster cast made of Frederick Bradley Deeming's head. Next to it, you will find a small metal plaque describing the ghastly sight in front of you, the plaster cast of a man's head who died over 130 years ago, as belonging to that of Jack the Ripper.